Holmes and the Theatre of Death by Val Andrews. Chapter 1. At the time of which I will now speak, rather to my surprise, I found myself sharing a fishing holiday in Scotland with my friend, Mr. Sherlock Holmes. The time was early in the April of 1911. The place Taybrook, a village near Perth, and the surprise due to my knowledge that Holmes was singularly uninterested in any sort of country pastime, especially where it entailed the catching and killing of creatures. However, he exiled in Sussex, tending his bees, had evidently reached that stage, as it did from time to time, when he craved the company of his only friend. My dear Watson, I see what you are contemplating on. An expedition to Perthshire in pursuit of our unfortunate trout. We were in the study of my North London home, and as the table bore the unmistakable preparation for an angling expedition. Flies, line, and reels. I was not open-mouthed with amazement at this statement. I said a rather obvious deduction for one of your skill, Holmes, except perhaps from my choice of locality. He said, "Come, Watson, you have a row of books upon angling subjects upon your shelf. I know from experience that you do not allow your domestics into this room, so naturally a film of dust has accumulated upon the top edge. Save for one which has obviously recently been removed, studied, and replaced. Its title, The Trout Streams of Perthshire. I note also that you plan to complete the expedition before the last week of April." Now he had my attention. "How could you know that?" He smiled and said, "Upon the table is your selection of flies for your jaunt." I agreed. He continued, "There is no mayfly among your collection. That ephemeral insect, with its 3 tails, is irresistible to the largest and finest trout, but useless, save when you ephemeral insect with its 3 tails is irresistible to the largest and finest trout, but useless, save when the real insect is swarming. This phenomenon occurs only in May, so I need say no more upon the subject. This being the last week in March, I felt sure that Holmes must have composed a monograph upon the subject of fishing lures, but I did not say so. Instead, I showed him the map of the area where I intended to operate, where several tributes of the tray provided excellent trout fishing. Then, to my absolute amazement, he asked, "How would you like to accompany me on your trip, Watson?" "I need a change of scenery, and whilst I do not fish, I enjoy communing with nature. I could find some local apiarists, just as you will have found some aged, partly retired doctor to look after your patients. Just think, Watson, I can sit there upon the bank, smoking my pipe, observing the birds of the air and the beasts of the field, whilst you entice the poor misguided trout to take your flies. However, our expedition into the wilds of Caledonia was to be delayed by a mild epidemic of scarlet fever. And so I did take those mayflies after all. Indeed, as I waded in a swift running stream, I left Holmes, who sat upon the bank, with strict instructions to watch for the first swarming of the Elixir-reads. It was already the 11th of May, and I was a little surprised not to have spotted them yet. As it was, I caught a few fair-sized trout, with the more common imitation dry flies, and Holmes would hurry over as each was unhooked and would give me a discourse on each. Typical of these was, "Ah, yes, Watson, here is an extremely wily customer, more intelligent, I think, than the average trout." Dutifully, I would ask, "Pray, how have you come to that conclusion, Holmes?" He would chuckle and say, "Why, there are 3 scars upon its mouth," suggesting that he was only partially taken the bait before realizing his mistake and has not, you will note, taken the barb. Then suddenly, such as post-mortem, was interrupted by the arrival of 2 men in a rowing boat. The man rowing interested us, little being obviously just plying his trade as a cab driver would in London. The other man, however, his fare was standing and peering in our direction with a hawk-like stance. He wore town clothing despite the mildness of the day and the rural Scottish surroundings. Holmes watched him with interest. A legal person, Watson, so I hope you remembered to settle any outstanding accounts before you left London. His eyes had narrowed to slits, and I knew that his eyesight was keener than my own. As he continued, note the marks upon his neck above the collar caused by the long and regular wearings of the advocate's neckband. His briefcase is typical of a lawyer, but also notice how he holds it as if his life depends upon its presence. Where are you? Or I might have placed it in the bottom of the boat. A man who is anxious to pursue some quest. Let us hope that our holiday is not about to be interrupted. Yet I could see that 8 years of retirement could not be depended upon the preclude of my friend's involvement. Should he become interested in a particular enigma, it happened before, and there was always a part of Sherlock Holmes which longed for the game to be afoot once more. As the boat drew level with us, where we sat upon the banks, the man in the dark grey greatcoat lifted his bowler hat and said, "By any chance, might one of you gentlemen be Mr. Sherlock Holmes?" My friend smiled politely and said, "I am he, and this is my friend and colleague, Dr. John H. Watson." "Might I ask your name, sir?" The sombrero-clad one said, I am Septimus Greyshot of the firm Luckins, Wild, Luckins, and Greyshot, solicitors. Please, can you assist me reach the bank? We hauled him up beside us, and he gasped and wheezed, then all but collapsed into the grassy hammock. I suspected a respiratory condition, but Holmes probably came nearer to his diagnosis. I fear that you have swallowed a flying ant, sir, for I see another adhering to your lip. I noticed that you emerged from a cloud of them in your boat. They only fly upon 2 or 3 days of each year, and would not make a good item for your selection of lures, Watson. Seldom used, but most effective on those few days. The solicitor coughed up the insect and soon recovered. Or should I say, my firm are most desirous to obtain your services, Mr. Holmes, upon a certain matter that has occurred in Edinburgh. I tried to trace you through a wire to your colleague, Dr. Watson, and I learned that you were somewhere hereabouts. I did quite a little detective work myself in locating you. Holmes explained that he was no longer in practice as a consulting detective, and had not been for some years, but I could see that he was loath to send the solicitor away without hearing him out. I said, We are staying at a local inn, sir, the White Hart. Perhaps you would join us there for a luncheon and explain further. He thanked me, saying I had to forego my breakfast to journey here from Edinburgh, and so I am as hungry as a hunter. We climbed into his boat. The good oarsman took the 3 of us down river to the village. Then we sat in the cool bar room at a table made from a stout Scottish ash, and demolished a good steak pie between the 3 of us. Then over pewter tankards of a local brew, our new friend got down to business. I will give the reader the solicitor's story, just as we heard it. Mr. Holmes, Doctor, you may or may not have heard of a theatrically renowned artiste who appeared to be under the nom de theatre of the great Lafayette. I made one of my only interruptions at this early point in the narrative, telling him that I had myself seen the performer mentioned at the North London Music Hall, that I believed that Holmes was rather less interested in Vaudeville performance. Holmes waved me into silence, so I said a little more. Well, his real name was Sigmund Neuberger, and he was of German and American origin. In America, he had been a routine artist in vaudeville. After a theatrical apprenticeship as a scene painter, eventually he enlarged his act until it took a number of magical illusions, which when he combined them with his abilities in the quick change line, made them sensational. And gradually he managed to create a very impressive show involving himself and sometimes as many as a score or more of other performers, billing himself as the Great Lafayette. He embarked upon a tour of Europe, which most recently brought him to these shores. Theatrical troupe and production which he headed was such a scope that he needed to have legal representation, which is where my firm and I became involved. He indulged in quite a bit of litigation concerning the content of his performance. To put this into simple terms, other artists were forever trying to copy his performance in various ways, as usually happens when a success is made. But to be perfectly honest, Neuberger would have made me take action for him at the drop of a hat. Sometimes it was scarcely justified. The tendency to rush into court at the slightest provocation made him far from popular with his fellow professionals. The result of this was that his many eccentricities, and I admit that he was an eccentric, became some of what exaggerated in variety and Vanduil circles. For example, legend has it that he drilled his assistants like a soldier and forced them to salute him if they should meet in the street. He was certainly disciplinary. Then there was a story which would have Lafayette thinking, advertising posters everywhere, and even sticking them onto the walls of public washhouses. Here, the origin is in the great ability with self-promotion, which, however, took more orthodox avenues, but there was one marked form of eccentricity which could hardly need exaggeration, because it was truly strange. He paused, and I felt as if I ought to make some remark, but Holmes' steely's eyes told me not to. So we waited for him to continue. It concerned his dog, Beauty. About 10 years ago or so, in America, Neuberger was given the dog as a gift by his great friend, Mary Houdini. It was a mongrel dog with a bit of greyhound in it, the sort that we would call a lurcher. Beauty was not the most attractive of dogs, but for some reason, Neuberger took her at once, and she was very soon became his closest companion. And he said that she was his only friend. If you went to dinner with him, you would be treated to the sight of the dog being seated at the table on a silk cushion and being served by waiters. The house which he recently purchased in London has a plaque over the door which states, "The more I see of men, the more I love my dog." On tour, the dog had her own rooms at the best hotel, joining that of her master's suite. She wore a collar bearing precious stones, and her likeness appeared upon all his headed noted paper. contracts, and even upon his checks. Neuberger would accept minor discourtesies shown toward himself by persons with whom he came into contact, but anyone who by word or deed show any such rudeness to his pet would have broken all contact with him forever. He had a fake pedigree created for his dog, in which she was referred to as an Assyrian Greyhound, or some such non existent breed. The dog even had a few brief appearances in his great Lafayette act. At this point, Holmes made his only interpretation. He said, "Mr. Greyshot, this is all very interesting, but does this Mr. Newberger's obsession with his dog have a bearing on the matter in hand? You find your narrative interesting, but I wish you would get to the point." He apologized for his long-winded narration and its continuance. He tended to cut a few corners. Mr. Holmes, he was so besotted with the animal that he was often heard to say without her his life would be worthless. Imagine, therefore, how worried I became when on Monday of this week he wired me to the effect that his dog had died of epilepsy. He was just starting his second week at the Empire Theatre, Edinburgh, and so I journeyed to Scotland to see if I could be of some help in consoling him. He was quite distraught and insisted that the dog should be buried locally at the Pierpoint Cemetery. Of course, the local church authorities refused to allow this, but I managed to find a way around and offered upon my behalf of my client to purchase a plot for his own eventual use. The authorities eventually agreed to allow the dog to be interred in a vault, provided that Newberger would sign a document to the effect that he promised to make the vault his own last resting place as well. We paid the £60 which they demanded for his vault and hoped that all would be well. Newberger had a dog embalmed and placed in a glass-topped coffin in readiness for interment. Dr. Watson, as a theater-goer, you will be aware that the variety venues present a twice-nightly system, with the first show at about 6 and the second one at around 8:30. Well, during the 6 o'clock performance, a Mr. Dubar from the funeral directors called around to see Newberger about Beauty's funeral. He was not from an animal undertaker's, mark you, but was a regular funeral director. I do not think this firm would normally have handled an animal's funeral, but the great Lafayette was a big star, and Mr. Durbar's establishment had the promise of handling his funeral as well as when the time came. He took a large pocket handkerchief and blew his nose noisily. Little did any of us know that Newberger, who had already declared that without his dog his life was over, would die within an hour. The second house was nearing its end, and the audience had gasped in admiration at the lavish oriental scene which was the setting for the final illusion, the lion's bride. The lion paced itself in a small cage in the palace setting. Beautiful, notched girls, curated, and other assistants appeared as Eastern soldiers. There were oriental lanterns and a gaze draperies, which all added to the splendor of the scene. Neuberger, as the great Lafayette, in a handsome Eastern costume, would have been preparing for his entrance when, quite suddenly, there appeared a sheet of flame which quickly engulfed the draperies, and smoke began to pour from the stage and into the auditorium. Holmes interrupted. I may not be an expert in the vaudeville scene, as both Watson and you have taken pains to make clear, but I am aware that all theaters, legitimate and otherwise, are compelled by law to fit a safety curtain of heavy asbestos to the proscenium, that it may be lowered to isolate the fire. Was this not operated? He replied, It was, and, as I am sure you know, such a curtain is in 3 horizontal directions. 2 of these dropped into place as planned, but the third failed to fall, so that there was a 10-foot gap just above the footlights, through which the accreted smoke soon found the auditorium. The audience behaved well and were dispersed into the street without any problem, but backstage, the scene was one of terrible inferno. I promised to get to the point as quickly as possible, so I will just say that 10 people perished backstage, including the great Lafayette, Sigmund Neuberger himself. His body was so badly burned that he was identified only from the costume he was wearing and the huge iron sword which he carried in his particular characterization. He paused for so long at this point, we began to think that this narrative was over. At length Holmes kindly but firmly said, Mr. Grayshot, I have listened with great attention to your narrative, which I have found extremely interesting. This story of Music Hall Star and 9 others having perished in a terrible fire is a tragic one, and the side issue of the man himself being obsessed by a fondness for his dog is intriguing. This man and his canine friend can now be interred together, and the episode will be over. Will it not? Save for some legal complications with which you and your firm will have to deal. Grayshot said, Alas, sir, that it were that uncomplicated. But you see, Mr. Holmes, I believe that there may be some serious misunderstanding regarding the body, which is about to be interred. I have a reason to believe that the body is that not of Sigmund Neuberger. He had our attention now, which he had been in danger of losing. I asked, What has put this idea in your mind, sir? as the body is, by your own admission, unrecognizable. He replied. There were no rings upon his fingers. Lafayette had diamond rings of immense value on almost every finger of each hand. Holmes said perhaps he removed them and left them in his dressing room or in some place of safety. Grisha quickly retorted, if he did it, would it be the first time that he had ever appeared on stage without them? That I or any surviving member of his staff could remember? I did look in the dressing room, though with great difficulty because it was badly gutted. There was no sign of the rings, which I am sure you will agree would have survived the fire. Holmes nodded and said, quite apart from the tragedy of your client's death, his estate for which you are responsible will be the poorer for this loss. Were the rings insured? He replied, yes. But the circumstances may make it difficult for the estate to make a claim. Felt honor bound to mention the missing rings to the police, but the inspector involved seemed singularly unaffected by my views. He is sure that I am mistaken and that the body is that of Newberger. He is convinced that the death is through misadventure and therefore does not even require an inquest. I am helpless to do more than I have done, and I implore you, Mr. Holmes, to accompany me to Edinburgh. The authorities may listen to you. Time is not on our side, because the funeral is set for Saturday, which gives us only 3 days in which to act. Holmes emptied his tankard slowly and recharged his pipe with Scottish mixture with irritating precision. He said, in London, I can buy this Scottish mixture from most tobacconists. But here in Scotland it seems to be rarely available. Yes, I will accompany you to Edinburgh, Greyshot. Much as I hate to forego my fishing holiday, there are aspects of this affair that intrigue me. Son, I suppose a few days away from the river will be out of the question for you? Hastily, I said, my dear Holmes, you know I would be happy to go with you to Edinburgh. Why, I haven't seen Arthur's Seat for years, since my student's days. And so within the hour we had entrained for Edinburgh. I wonder if what we lay ahead would be another episode to remember, or merely an interrupted fishing expedition. On the train journey from Perg to Edinburgh, I was, as so often in the past, pressed into service to take notes for Holmes concerning salient points as he interrogated Greyshot. For now the time had passed for the solicitor to narrate. Now he was questioned thoroughly on a number of matters, which at the time at least seemed to Holmes to be important. Mr. Greyshot, I realize that the fire on the stage started very quickly, but with the regulations enforced by most first-class theaters, I am surprised and, of course, dismayed to hear that the death toll was so heavy. Surely there was a means of egress for the people backstage. Greyshot said, there certainly were, and they conformed to regulations. But those who were cut off by the flames, including Newberger, had evidently relied upon a past door, which would have led them to the comparative safety of the auditorium. Those who escaped had taken the opposite means of exit through the stage door and adjacent fire exit. Holmes showed interest. You mean the past door was locked? He nodded. That is what transpired. I dared to ask, was this not rather unusual? Unusual and illegal, but I would rather that too much was not made of this. Holmes said sternly, 10 people lost their lives as a consequence of that door being locked. Mr. Grayshot, how can I or anyone else be expected to make little of it? The solicitor looked sheepish as he said, apart from the legal aspect, there is the insurance to be considered. If the assurance company involved hear of this, there may be some difficulty in getting them to pay. Holmes snapped. But this surely will only affect badly upon the theater, and will not affect your client, will it not? His shrewd eyes held Grayshot's gaze, and the solicitor's voice all but shook as he said, Mr. Holmes, the door was locked at Newberger's express instructions. There was an atmosphere and a silence that you could not have cut with a knife. Eventually, Holmes said, Sir, what possible reason could there have been for your client to have issued instructions for such an important means of safe exit to be immobilized? Rather guilty, Grayshot said. To preserve his secrets, Mr. Holmes, he was forever being spied upon by fellow illusionists, and even by members of the public who were simply curious. The journalists' fraternities were also notorious for trying to learn his methods that they might publish them for their readers' benefits. Holmes was genuinely surprised. You mean to tell me that a stage magician's secrets are of such public interest? I am more than surprised. I was surprised too, though not to the extent of my friend. In my student days, I had seen the wonders of Mascalini and Devant, and even in my middle age, I retained an interest in such practitioners. The stage illusionist's art. As already mentioned, I had seen a performance by the great Lafayette and his company a short while earlier. I said, people are indeed puzzled by such things. Holmes and some are determined to learn how it is all done. Mr. Newberger's performance, as I witnessed it, however, seemed to have a rather wider appeal, presenting color, music, spectacles, and of course wild animals that disappeared with amazing facility. Probably, Mr. Grayshot, you have witnessed the performance many times and could give Holmes a better idea of its style and content than I could. Holmes indicated that this might be useful, and Grayshot gave us a very good description of a typical performance by the great Lafayette. Well, the curtain went up on a stage full of properties, and Lafayette started in an orthodox manner, producing pigeons, ducks, and his dog. Then this led up to the very unusual illusion in which Lafayette as a sculptor created a figure of a girl from lumps of clay. The figure came to life and posed amidst multicolored fountains, which suddenly materialized. Now, Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, what I have so far described might be typical of any great illusionist. But from that point onward, performance would go into realms of fantasy. Still in the persona of an artist, he would take an Arabian assistant and transform his costume into an ever-changing parade of characters, everything from Lloyd George to the Tsar of Russia. Then he would walk off stage and instantly mark you. The Arabian would move his router costume to reveal himself as Lafayette. Holmes interrupted. You suggest that he did this without recourse to a stage double? Grayshot confirmed that this was fact. Yes, sir, and it happened just as I've described. You see, he always told me that there were only 7 principles in the illusionist armory, but that he had discovered an 8th. Take the final offering, the Lion's Pride, the scene that was being enacted when the fire started. It took the form of a playlet, and without bothering you with a full detail, the plot dealt with a princess who was about to be thrown into a lion's cage. The audience saw her being trussed up, ready to be sacrificed, whilst the very real full-maned lion paced the small cage. Lafayette, disguised as an Arab warrior and playing her lover, entered on his wonderful black horse. As the assistants made to thrust the princess into the cage, Lafayette leaped into the fray and attacked the lion. The animal reared up on its hind legs and removed its own headpiece to reveal that it was in fact the great Lafayette. Yet another of his miraculous transpositions. However, on that fateful night, the point in the piece had not quite been reached. Holmes considered what he had heard and then said, Mr. Grayshot, I do hope that you are not going to suggest to me that Neuberger has some sort of supernatural powers. He replied, No, sir. I am just stating the fact that his performances had upon his audience, without, though, trying to explain it myself. How can one person change places with another, however clever the magician may be? By this time, I had filed my angling almanac with notes and was rummaging in my pockets for fresh writing paper. Holmes had knocked out his pipe and was recharging it as he said, I would rather we spent the rest of the journey discussing useful facts rather than discussing fables. Tell me more of the fire itself. You say that it is thought to have started by curtains catching fire from a naked flame on a hanging ornamental lamp. I am not myself as familiar with the bylaws governing such things as I am sure you are yourself, Grayshot, but it occurs to me that those fabrics must have been treated to prevent such an occurrence. Presumably, the painted scenery must have likewise have been prepared to resist fire. Grayshot agreed, saying, Everything was just as it should have been. In that respect, Mr. Holmes, My friend looked thoughtful and said, "And yet the stage became an inferno within less than a minute." Ah, well, doubtless we shall learn more of an examination. The tragic scene.